All right. Well, let's have our review session. We'll spend a few minutes here. Hopefully not the whole time, unless you have a lot of questions. But so you've got the handout with the study guide. It gives the instructions at the top. You'll have one of your colleagues to thank. I won't mention her by name. She knows who she is. But she sent me one of those scathing, I keep using the word scathing, emails. No, she was nice. But she asked if I'd consider having an extra hour for the final exam. Now, I've already done the final exam, so I think I'm inclined to do that. I hate to do that because I feel like I'm being mean, because then some of you will take a full 3 hours to take the final exam, and your wife will yell at you because, you're taking 3 hours out of watching the kids or whatever. But I'm okay with that if you all think that's good. I hate to have a 3-hour final exam, though. I mean, what if I had made it 3 hours? I mean, would that be okay? I don't want y'all to be angry about that. Like, he just gave us a 3-hour final exam. My point is, I don't think you'll need all that time if you do your preparation. A lot of you will finish well early. I mean, even within the 2-hour time limit. So I'm not writing an exam for 3 hours. That's my point. But if I make it 3 hours, it's for your benefit. Is that okay? Did you hear the grace there? Okay. So I may go ahead and do that. I know some of you benefit from having more time. That way your test anxiety is resolved and you have a lot more time to read the question and understand the question before you answer it and all that stuff. So, all right. We'll have a 3-hour exam. So that's going to be different than what's on your final exam study guide. It'll say 3 hours in the instructions. All right. We ended the midterm with Psalms, and so really we're moving into wisdom material with the final exam, and from the wisdom material with the book of Proverbs all the way to the book of Chronicles. So some high points along the way you'll see in my study guide. We got into a discussion on, what is, the big idea of wisdom, but we got into a discussion on how it compares to the similarity with the instructions of this Egyptian source of wisdom, the instruction of Amananamopi. And we talked about how Proverbs makes this connection. The scholarly discussion is, who borrowed from who. I'm not going to get into that on the final exam, but the one thing that we emphasized on that point was really this slide here, and the idea that, if you've got the author of the Proverbs, the activity of recognizing that all truth is God's truth. So if there's statements of truth that are emerging from another culture, but then they're brought in under the umbrella of divine inspiration, that doesn't force us to run the opposite direction. There's a recognition that they're just as authoritative now because they're in the Bible, and true because they're representative of God's created order. And you have people who have fallen, but still divine image bearing going on, and they can recognize true things as well. So just a little bit there. How did Israel get her wisdom material? We had a little discussion about school or no school, and the scholarly recognition is that there's no real evidence that Israel had wisdom schools like existed in other nations around. They were more common, but not so in Israel. But yet I brought up the point that you've got lots of wise people within the covenant community, right? We had that discussion of the emerging out of the covenant community under the oversight of the king, King Solomon, who's collecting and evidence of other kings like Hezekiah collecting and bringing into the authorized version of wisdom for the covenant community. So you've got all kinds of sources, and we had this discussion through this slide, and I guess I found agreement with this German scholar here on where these proverbs were coming from. Well, they're homegrown. They're coming out of a covenant community, which was unique, right, for Israel. Unlike any other confused pagan nation around. Israel's covenant community was producing these, and you've got moms at home and raising kids and dads and all this kind of activity going on, producing these short, pithy sayings with regards to Proverbs. And Proverbs were, really, a lot of them applied the Torah, the first 5 books. Application for life was really the idea behind why this collection of Proverbs. Whether it be, the Dave Ramsey method for keeping out of debt, or all of these other really practical kinds of things that were really important for the covenant community. So that's what we have in the book of Proverbs. Psalms were evidence for the singing church. Proverbs were the important and significant for the practical applying of God's teaching to our lives kind of church. Let's see. Okay. There might be some things that you might want to review a little bit about these categories. Remember the categories for how poetry, or in this case Proverbs, this is really what we're talking about, is that the kind of writing that was going on was this Hebrew parallelism. And we talked about how this works and these different categories of creating a contrast with the antithetic, or just a restatement with a synonymous, or a progressive. In other words, you're taking one idea and with the, you flip it over and then you're expanding on that idea in some way. So those are the 3 categories there. Did I have that one? Yeah, Hebrew poetry and parallelism. All right. Let's see. So the idea of a proverb, it's brief, it's short, it's pithy, it's grounded in experience. It comes from careful observation of life around and the experience of one's life. It's also expressed in a memorable form. And it's short and pithy in its ability to dive in and dive out quickly in terms of its value of unpacking some practical insight. So if you read Proverbs, you don't want to read them fast. They're independent units. So you stop, pause, and reflect and say, what's the timeless principle here? So that's what we have. How we interpret Proverbs. We spent a little time looking at Proverbs 31 for an example of what we don't want to do is just take Proverbs out of its historical context. I mean, where we can, and it's a little more tricky with Proverbs, but we have to remember, if we're looking for that timeless principle for Proverbs 31, instead of getting overwhelmed with the details, we see and recognize that the Proverbs 31 woman looks more like this. She's overseeing the household industry, the little business. She's the number 1 ranking female in the household. So she's got an important role. She's vice president, you might say, of the little business. So all of the details about food preparation and the management of servants and the business that she's involved in, selling some kind of clothing or some cottage industry. She's providing an extra income for the household, which is made up not just of mom, dad, son, and daughter, but you've got servants who are also involved in the household structure. So everybody's being provided for, everybody around the table. And so Proverbs 31 woman, in that context, we don't feel so overwhelmed. I mean, in a culture where food preparation took a large percentage of the day. You were harvesting, you were out in the fields, you were caring for, driving away livestock that were eating your corn crop for that summer. You've got a lot of these things that are going on. So I kind of, translated that to my own Proverbs 31 woman and described her. She liked that. I showed her my list. She was really appreciative. We need to do that with our Proverbs 31 women, by the way. That was the application. All right. So Proverbs. So we're out of Proverbs, interpretation of Proverbs. We get into Ecclesiastes. Let's see. Proverbs. Just we talked about some specific themes that emerge out of Proverbs, like deceit or lying, the financial themes, some of those things. That's okay. So we get into Ecclesiastes. Let's see, we talked about the overall purpose of Ecclesiastes, and talking about how Ecclesiastes is a representative of a wisdom book that's, the book itself is focusing on one theme, and that big idea out of Ecclesiastes is the idea of the in-between. The moral value of life is what emerges out of the book of Ecclesiastes. Is that right? We looked at some worldly examples of other ways that the world around us is explaining this question or diving into this question. So if life is unjust and God is just, then what is the moral value of life? So everybody's got to come up with an answer to that question. So that's the purpose of Ecclesiastes. And the way that the author begins, I think I talked about my view on the authorship of the book, and thinking that Solomon might be writing here, but near the end of his life, looking back on a life of really regret, which lines up with the scathing review of the author of Kings that we looked at. He made some mistakes along the way, but at the end of his life, he's giving to his kingdom. This is warts and all. This is what I did, but I learned from this, and here's what I want you to walk away with. So the big idea of the book of Ecclesiastes, at the end of the book, he has his thesis statement, right? Fear the Lord and obey his commandments. So that thesis statement kind of serves as the hinge for the meaning, the purpose of the book. But along the way, we see that it's a lot. It gets a little bit edgy. The book of Ecclesiastes talks about the futility idea. Remember, we talked about the vanity of vanity. Futility, that idea of futility is the breath idea, or it's just, it's you kind of feel it, but you can't grab onto it. Kind of the futility. I think, let's see, I'm going to move ahead here. I think we expanded it. We talked about the futility idea. Where did we talk about it? Let's see. Sorry about that. Yeah, the breath of breaths idea, the idea of being empty. And
is that the one that goes back to Genesis 3?
Yeah, I think, here we go. Yeah, let's see. Right. I think what we did there is, rooted the idea of futility links to Romans 8, Paul's discussion of God subjecting the world to futility in response to or in judgment against the rebellion of humanity. Of course, that goes back to Genesis 3 and the idea of God responding to the futility of the devil, Satan, and the man and the woman in different ways. But the futility that we experience becomes the common experience for all of humanity in terms of... so the book really, this strikes a chord, right, with for the purposes of apologetics. Let's see. One other thing that we looked at in, let's see here. You might want to make this connection in terms of not with the Pink Floyd song, but right there. But we talked about different examples that I think Solomon raises up in the book. The question, let's see here. I want to go back one little section here that I probably should. Let's see if I can find it. It was back here. There's a section in Ecclesiastes in chapter 1. Chapter 1, verse 13, 16, and 19. The English translation uses the word mind. Solomon sets his mind to this. Solomon sets his mind to that. But those end up being, for Solomon, false, detours in the wrong direction. So setting your mind, really the idea, the Hebrew word is heart. So I made the connection there to the Shema passage. Loving the Lord your God with all your heart is what we're supposed to do. And that ends up lining up with the thesis statement of the whole book at the end. Obeying, fearing the Lord, which is the idea of loyalty, demonstrated obedience, the heart with feet, and all of that we talked about. So loving the Lord with all your heart. Perhaps Solomon is saying, I set my heart to this, I set my heart to that. He's admitting to his, the fallacy, what he committed or what he did that was really his whole life. A lot of his life was setting his heart to the things other than loving the Lord your God with all your heart. Not his whole heart. I made the argument that he's the half-hearted king in a lot of ways. And that's what I was talking about there. So, let's see. All right, let's move ahead to one slide. I keep missing it here. Sorry, I'm being... is it here? One second. We're getting close. In Ecclesiastes chapter 7, we spent a little time the contrast between good and bad, and in Ecclesiastes, I'll just turn there. We spent a little time talking about this. Chapter 7, verse 13. Consider the work of God, for who is able to straighten what he has bent? In the day of prosperity or good, be happy. But in the day of adversity or bad, consider. God has made the one as well as the other. Remember that discussion. So there we have the good, bad. Of course, it's translated differently, prosperity or adversity. It's the same Hebrew word, tov, good, ra, bad. But it's interesting, we talked about that discussion as it relates to other context and as it links to, of course, going all the way back to the garden, and again, going back to Genesis, we have the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. So interestingly, part of the futility experience is having the knowledge of good and bad, but asking the question of, is God the author of, good and bad? We went to talked about Genesis 3:14 through 19, and really there's where we see this idea of futility showing up again, and the act of futility showing up with filling and multiplying, ruling the household and subduing, the idea of crop bearing and all the work that Adam's to do in the fields becomes an activity of futility. So what we then talked about, and we linked that to Romans chapter 8, and in the midst of this world of good and bad, we introduced the idea of suffering. Let's see here. Genesis 3:15, we talked about, there was going to be one to come from the seed of the woman who would suffer on behalf of this rebellion and deal with the satanic agenda. So that's the promised he from Genesis 3:15. And we talked about Christian suffering from Romans 8. You might want to review that just a little bit. Just Paul says we're to suffer with him, suffering with Christ, so that, and we talked about the glory idea, that idea that we'd be glorified with him. And Paul says there's no comparison. There's this glory, and all of this drawn up on the whiteboard, but it all leads to glory. So it seems as if in this world of good and bad, there's one route to producing this kind of glory. We talked about the faithfulness and fidelity of the one who has the heart with the feet and is walking through the world that's been subjected to futility, but by faith and trust in the Lord produces glory. And that kind of glory I just suggested may not come from a world that's not set up this particular way. Let's see. And interestingly, that connects to Job and the Job conversation. Job chapter 2, verse 10. And we see places like that where, remember, in response to his wife, who's saying, curse God and die, Job says, no, we can't just accept the good from the Lord without accepting the bad. Doesn't make God the author of evil, but it recognizes that God is, subjecting. He's the one who subjected the world to futility. So it's that. And our response as we navigate through that with faith is what we're talking about. So maybe just review that a little bit and bring those connections together. The suffering as a saint is one way God gets glory out of a fallen world. It's through the suffering of us, through our faithful walk as we trust in him along the way. Let's see. Okay, we move on. So that's the good and bad in Ecclesiastes. Song of Solomon. We moved ahead to Song of Solomon. There we go. An important book for teenagers. No, I'm just kidding. But how do we interpret the book? There's just some, maybe, a question or two on that. I think we made it pretty clear in terms of, let's see. Just, the big idea. The emphasis that I put on the book, and of course I think I'm right, but there's other interpretive options out there, love relationship between, I think I summarized them here. Those options and the one that, not that one, this one. Here, right here. So Solomon, again, I think if he's writing not about his own true love, which that would be kind of complicated, but someone in his kingdom and the love relationship, he's using perhaps a real couple as an example of romance and the celebration of romance within a married couple. Of course, I developed the progression in our discussion, so not until Song of Solomon chapter 4 do you have the consummation of the marriage relationship and the wedding night, and then the celebration of romance from that point beyond. So it's just the idea there of celebration of romance. We get into the book of Job. Man, I better move a little faster here. I'm sorry. All kinds of stuff. I challenge the guys to step up and all those things, watching these movies with their special other, significant other, finding the romance in these pictures. I had a lot of fun with that. All right. Pictures like this. That's how we describe beauty and celebrate romance. Famous scenes. All right. The book of Job. I spent a lot of time in Job. In terms of, as the book of Job. If you want to spend a little more time, kind of going back and kind of reflecting on what we talked about in class, I'd strongly encourage you at all focus on the book of Job, because really, in that discussion on that day, we spent a whole class period and a half, I think, on the book of Job. We talked about how it's a book that deals with the question of suffering or the moral value of suffering, but in lights of, and in contrast to skeptics and critics out there like Richard Dawkins and certain worldviews that have a hard time, really, honestly, dealing with the question of the value of human suffering. And they don't have the foggiest idea what to do about it. They could ignore it, pretend it doesn't exist, call it survival of the fittest or whatever, but really Christianity, in the biblical presentation, deals with it very honestly and from books like Job in a real practical way. So we talked about how Job also deals with the subject of grief and the idea of grieving. And I think, let's see. and how practical the book of Job would be for any of us in ministry, or even if we have friends across the street who are trying to help someone walk through their personal experience of grief and loss, this kind of suffering. In our discussion, we talked about the beginning of the book and how a book like Job could be very practical for, let's say, a group that's in exile. Talk about grief. What are they grieving over? Well, we've lost our country, we've lost our nation, our temple. I've had some lost relatives along the way in the battle, and now we're over here and we're grieving. And this is perhaps a practical application of the book of Job. And we talked about the book of Job is really against this idea of God, the gods reward the righteous and punish the wicked. Of course, that's the immediate what the book of Job speaks against and argues against, because that's not Job's situation. So it's a different set of questions. And we talked about testing. So we brought in that idea of testing as then you've got the Lord's hand is involved in that. So that you see that the book of Job, testing is something that the Lord allows for his faithful as a means of refining faith, cultivating faith. And we saw all of the categories of Job's situation with regards to the adversity that he starts to experience. And that key question that we have in Job chapter 2, shall I just accept the good and not the bad or the adversity from the Lord? So in terms of counseling individuals with who are going through grieving, we talked about that a lot, and the practical aspects, I think, of the book of Job. If you're along the way, we talked a lot about different kind of like stopping points in the book of Job, like, what's maybe a good thing to do if you're dealing with somebody with grief? What's the first things that Job's friends do when they show up to the scene? They're just silent, things like that. So there's little practical things that came out of our conversation. But we talked about the book of Job, and it's, I guess I forgot to say this earlier, but how it connects to the idea of national grieving for Israel. And we made the comment, remember, we made the connection between Job's question, shall I only accept the good and not the bad, and the same question that shows up in Lamentations chapter 3. You remember that? That was a significant connection, because there you've got two situations where both authors are addressing grief. And Jeremiah, the prophet, is addressing grief in Lamentations chapter 3. And there we talked about the soul that is remembering, the soul that remembers. Remember that in, I can't remember exactly what verse it is, but it comes right before, great is thy faithfulness. It refers on the loving kindness of the Lord. That's what the soul remembers. So this all comes back to my famous picture, and you're welcome to describe it in an answer. You're trying to, make the continuity. But here's where the soul who remembers. What's the soul who remembers? So this is the soul that's grieving, but in the midst of that grief is answering the question, shall I only accept the good and not the adversity? The answer is no, I accept both, because both are from the hand of the Lord if I understand that my situation might be related to this idea. And this is God's response to a fallen world. And out of the fallenness of the world, people like this are, according to Paul, generating glory that far outweighs and pales in comparison to anything that we could generate. This is the eschatological encouragement that comes out of this discussion. So a little bit of that will be on the exam, and spend a little time on the book of Job, and you'll be in good shape. We talked about, and we move over back to we finished the wisdom books, back to the history books. Oh, I love that picture. Not that picture, but this picture. I'm looking at one behind. That's the conversation that we're having with regards to the soul. that remembers in its connection to Lamentations chapter 3. All right. Let's see, anything else? Let's see. Okay, we need to move on to, there's the testing idea that comes out of that's where we find it in the slide set. If you want to go back and review the slides, you know that. So, there. I'm one slide behind you. I'm sorry. Now we go to Ezra. Here we go. There we go. So, life after exile. Now we're dealing with the audience that's come back. We said a lot about in developing the discussion on Ezra and Nehemiah in terms of the audience that's come out of exile. There they are. There's their picture. No, I'm just kidding. But the idea that they're going into exile. Oh, I can't see the glare. They're going into exile off of the experience of the destruction of Jerusalem. And while they're there, transformation occurs because of Ezekiel the prophet and the author of Kings, who, this is the pressure that's being put on them to get their spiritual life and act together. So the establishment of the covenant community, I think, starts to begin over that 70-year period, such that we start to see now in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and Chronicles, the result of that is now we've got a different audience that comes out of that testing environment, and they return with a different vantage point, a different perspective. They want to be a covenant community. So a little discussion on that in terms of the significance of what's going on before, during, and after. Let's see, that's the group that's going into exile, and we talk about them, and the difference in the group that comes back. So that's what we do. We had a little talk about that and the map and the significance of the length. Walking from Indianapolis to Dallas, Texas, is how long the journey took. So they had to be serious about their return. All right, now we talked about, let's see here. A little bit about the book. We had a little discussion about Ezra and Nehemiah being one unified book for a lot of the history for the Jewish reading, but then when did the books become separate? When did the books become Ezra and Nehemiah as separate books? You might just want to review that a little bit there. Let's see. In terms of where this timeline here helps. It's a picture worth 1,000. That one. How these all fit in with regards to Zerubbabel, and then Ezra and Nehemiah, and where Esther, the book of Esther, fits in with regards to that kind of that 57-year gap there, from when the temple's rebuilt to when Ezra comes back and starts to he brings his group back, and then he starts to rebuild the covenant community. And then we have another gap between that completion and then when Nehemiah starts to focus on the wall rebuilding. And so that helps us to keep track of where we are with regards to the Persian rulers who are ruling during the time. And I put Daniel here in the lower portion just to kind of as a placeholder to know where is his ministry taking place. So it's interesting that we see this picture has a lot to say, because we see that God is using individuals like Daniel, or when we get to the book of Esther, Mordecai and Esther herself behind the scenes, right? In terms of tipping the dominoes with regards to these Persian rulers who are issuing these decrees, right? Favorable or not favorable towards where the Jews are in the diaspora, but mostly we're concerned with what's going on back in Jerusalem there. So let's see. So that chart's really helpful. I'm just going to go off of this now. Let's see. What do we have here? We talked a little bit about, let's see, I'm kind of starting to, Zerubbabel is going to, I use this slide here just to talk about the opposition that Zerubbabel experiences. In the opposition that came from this group who are, let's see, kind of starting to have a fade here. Remember our discussion of those who were left behind after the destruction of Jerusalem, and the Babylonians sent in their own people to, there was this cohabitation. So the beginning of the Samaritans, so really they have their beginning before this group comes back. The covenant community is established, and that this opposition starts to come from the group that's still hanging around. They want to have some association with the Israelites who have come back, but leaders like Zerubbabel, and then we see with Nehemiah later, deals with this opposition and says, no, we don't want to have anything to do with you because we're trying to have church and you're having a different kind of church. And so just remind yourself of that conversation. Some of the other things that happen in the book of Nehemiah, like, let's see, that's Ezra. Let's see. It's interesting, make the connection with, like, say, the prophet Haggai. Even today, I mentioned chapter 2 in Haggai, the prophetic encouragement that's going on, parallel and also in line with other authors that we've looked at. Like Haggai chapter 2 is that prophetic encouragement for example, the temple rebuilding that was going on during the time of Ezra and under Zerubbabel and Ezra during that time. Let's see here. I'm not tracking well with my slides. That's the problem. In opposition, and we get to the book of Nehemiah, for example. Chapter 5 is a great example of Nehemiah's okay, let's see here. The general category I'm looking for is just review your notes with regards to Nehemiah, certain specific places that we talked about, how he steps in as a spiritual leader, and certain things that leap off the page with regards to his role in dealing with conflict, organizing the reconstruction project on the wall, dealing with the problems internally. Do you remember the discussion of how the economic pressures that were kind of pushing in? There were people that were having to mortgage their homes and put their children into servitude, and just to pay put food on the table. So how's Nehemiah respond to that situation? If you remember, we talked about that a little bit, and how he, not only reprimanded some of the wealthy leadership class around, but he even included himself in the reprimand, which is a great example of spiritual leadership. All right. I talked about Ezekiel's role with the exiles in terms of how he's the prophet to the exiles and bringing about the transformation. We get to the book of Esther. Let's see, I'll move ahead here. There's Nehemiah. Focus on the walls. One of the things about talking about Ezekiel, why I bring Ezekiel up with this picture and this discussion, is that we talked about how Nehemiah starts right away, and we see it in his prayers, how theologically rich his prayers are. His prayer there at the beginning, I think it's in Nehemiah chapter 1, it reflects a real depth. And where does that depth come from? Well, it comes from, and we talked about the covenant community that's in exile, right? He's leaving that community and he's coming into this community, this covenant community. So there's people back there under the leadership of, starting perhaps with Ezekiel, setting up the theological correct situation. So people are growing up in exile, knowing the Word of God and learning how to pray and fast and all of the spiritual disciplines, and all of this is being brought back. So it's just evident, here's the point, that there is a vibrant and alive covenant community in exile. We see it in the lives of Daniel and Mordecai and Esther, and here we have Nehemiah leaving that exilic community, coming in, and he's ready to go, just like what we talked about with this slide back in our discussion of David. You know, before David battles Goliath, he not only knows how to use physical weapons, but he's got the spiritual weapons all ready to go as well. Where'd that come from? His preparation in Bethlehem, growing up in a small town kind of thing. So I just made that point there a little bit. So the historical context for the book of Esther, let's see here. Let's see here. Really what I'm talking about, and some of the things that we talked about in the book of Esther, I'll be quick. Didn't mean to take the whole time, sorry. The book doesn't mention the word Yahweh or God at all, but if you remember, if you just review your notes, you'll see that I pulled out of certain significant places where, even though the word God is not showing up, we see evidence of the faith of Mordecai, the faith of Esther, for such a time as this. Seems to suggest the divine hand at work. We talked about Esther and her Daniel in the lion's den experience, right? Remember, she had to walk through, basically, if I go this way, it's death. If I go this way, it's death. What choice do I have for such a time as this? Well, you do what, So there's evidence of Esther leading and rallying some fasting, even though the word prayer is not used. We assume things like, oh, well, that's, it's going to go hand in hand. People are praying for her from that exilic covenant community. And so they're expecting God to work. Well, why? There seems to be this anticipation of, this is the God of the Jews. Well, Mordecai, he's a Jew. Remember that? And how Haman's, little pep squad, his wife and the other advisors were saying, well, you can't, there seems to be this subtle hint that the God of the Jews is at work here. So things like that are more prevalent in the book to show us that it's a book that's, even though God's not mentioned, shouldn't be thought of as a secular book, that kind of a thing. We talked about the lion's den for Esther. And then we get into Chronicles. So we talked about it a little bit last week, but just as a quick reminder, we talked about why Chronicles begins with the genealogy that goes all the way back to Adam and creation. Why is that important for the group that's come back? The general comparison of Chronicles with Samuel Kings in terms of how they account for the kings, the negativity versus the positive high points for Chronicles, that general idea. The idea of selectivity. We talked about the author of Chronicles having source material, but then being selective about what he wants to choose to include or enhance in his historical account for theological purposes. Why? Because he wants to encourage his group. Let's see. We talked about in Chronicles a little bit of extra emphasis that the author puts on the worship and the organization of those who are doing worship in the temple during that time period, and how that reflects Ezra and Nehemiah's same concern for organization and where the heritage goes from the Levitical priesthood to those who are leading in worship and all of those things that will be important for this post-exilic group, because they're going to be having church too, and they want to do it the right way. So all of those things. David, the chronicler, his assessment of Solomon, what he leaves out with regards to Solomon. Let's see. All right. And I just want to maybe talk about this as something that you might just kind of reflect on in terms, and some of these things maybe pull from maybe the whole semester. But we talk about, I've talked a lot about, especially as we focused on the last half of the semester, getting from exile to the return. And, the idea there is you've got this audience over here. They've been prepared and God has worked in them and they're ready to go. And then God drops the bomb of the Cyrus decree and then they're allowed to come back. And so here's my question. What are the voices that they're hearing? Where are the sources of encouragement for this group? Not only just the precipitating event, but every step along the way that we see, and we've talked about it in class. They're hearing from, prophets. They're hearing from the, psalms that have been written. They're hearing from historians that are writing down history and theology to encourage them to come back and do God's will and do it the right way. So you might want to reflect back and think of kind of broadly all the various ways that we've brought out in class in our Monday morning discussions on all the various ways that God did encourage them through his little megaphones along the way. So, just think about that. That might be a good reflection exercise for you as well. All right. Sorry, I just ranted. I was just trying to give a little narrative, a little more color, a little splash of color here, a little splash of color there. Hopefully it was helpful. I think you'll all do great on the final exam. Hope you have fun with it. If you have any nervous moments in your preparation, you can always send me an email and I'll respond to you as you're preparing for the final exam. All right? And I think this, I'll just stop talking. Okay.